We'd like to welcome to the session. Let me start sharing. Hold on just a second. Let me. Nathan, am I showing the slides only, or am I getting the demonstration screen?
You're getting the full demonstration. So I think if you click the use slideshow up at the top, that may transition you.
Okay,
there you go.
Thank you. Okay, everyone, sorry for the glitch here. We'd like to welcome you to this session on the changing landscape of statewide assessment shifts towards systems of assessment. We're grateful to NCME for sponsoring this virtual session. It consists of 3 presentations. I'll be giving the first, and then colleagues from the Center for Assessment, Nathan Dadey and Michelle Boyer, will have a presentation on developing a validity research agenda using one state as the context. And then our colleagues from NWA, Abby Jarovec, Paul Nichols, and Garen Giannopoulos will be sharing some of the lessons that they have been learning in developing an innovative assessment using agile test development, also within a particular state context. Following that, we'll have discussion and moderated discussants' comments, and then moderated discussion by Carla Evans from the Center for Assessment. We welcome the questions and comments. We invite you to put those into the chat or the QA at any time during the session. Carla will be monitoring those, and we'll pick them up in the discussion time. We would appreciate your putting them in chat rather than raising your hand, because the chat preserves the comments, and that will enable the presenters to be able to follow up individually with anyone if we don't get to your questions or comments during the session. In my presentation, I'd like to talk a little bit about the shift toward balanced assessment systems within the context of state assessment systems, and give a quick overview about the past, the present, and some thoughts about what might be coming up. I'll give some background, talk about systems of assessment, and then give an introduction to some of the context of the work that my colleagues will be speaking about. The context, I think, is that we're in a new generation of assessment policy and design. In state assessment, the context has heavily been shaped by federal policy, starting in 1995 with the passage of the Elementary and Secondary Education Act, and then continuing with its reauthorizations. State assessments have been shaped by that federal policy, and in particular federal requirements, starting in 1994 and then continuing through the No Child Left Behind and Every Student Succeeds Act. Though the state assessments have gone from custom state assessments to currently we see most of the state assessments are custom assessments, meaning that they are developed for individual states or groups of states, and now they're online. But there's a proliferation of different approaches that people are trying now, still in relation to the state assessment, but looking for something different. Why is that the case? I think this because of 2 reasons. One is that there's a recognition that the current accountability system, which the architecture has been the same since No Child Left Behind, that there's a recognition that that summative assessment, that's part of that, does not provide enough information to directly inform improved learning. There are a number of different aspects of that, but There's a call for different types of assessments that will give better information at more timely ways and sometimes under the control of someone besides the state. You'll see that there are, anytime there's a new assessment, new use, that we need the validation. And Nathan and Michelle will explicitly be showing their validation research agenda. It's also often coupled with calls for different accountability systems. And so if there's a different accountability system, then there may be a different type of assessment system as well. This is a recognition that assessments occur within a larger theory of action. And so we need to know about the theory of action and then situate the assessment within it. There are two types of evaluations that will help with that. One is the familiar validation of the assessments themselves. The other is more of a program evaluation about the theory of action. How is the theory of action working? Different uses imply different assessments. We always talk about different purposes. I thought I'd have purposes and uses. I gave a couple of examples here. Under the improvement side, one is an accountability theory of action. Another is a much more direct instructional improvement theory of action. Those would call for different types of assessments. The box on the right shows, as we talk about COVID and starting school up again, there are different instructional models or approaches that we might have. And again, those three examples gave different types of assessments that would be needed depending on the instructional model that we had. Assessment systems consist of multiple assessments, and they are systems by design. My colleague Scott Mary and others have laid out 4 criteria for assessment systems: coherence, comprehensiveness, continuity, and utility. I gave the reference at the bottom. Those are important things to ensure that we actually have a system and not just a collection of assessments. Again, they're part of a larger system. Accountability is one that we usually think about, but there are other systems: instruction, curriculum, the policy that we have, and so on. And the assessments are always shaped by the resources and overall goals of those larger systems in which they're situated. Sometimes those aren't coherent, and so there will be challenges in the assessment system trying to deal with multiple demands on the assessment. Today I'm going to focus, and my colleagues are going to focus on interim assessments. Interim assessments are, broadly speaking, things that are between summative and formative. There are lots of different ways that they might be interim. Some of those are listed on the slide. The one criteria that I wanted to mention came from a paper that Marianne Perry and Scott Marion and I wrote over 10 years ago. And that was saying the interim assessments are under one definition intended to have the results combined or aggregated. And so that usually means that they need to be on the same scale or have something like a scale score that allows comparability. That turns out as a challenging criterion. If we think about a system of interim assessments, multiple assessments during 1 year, sometimes it's called modular. That's something that my colleague Nathan Dadey and colleagues have written extensively about, or interim, which we often see. You might think of something like something that happens periodically. Like the example here is Q1, Q2, Q3, and Q4. In the state assessment context, there is a program reauthorized under the Federal Every Student Succeeds Act called the Innovative Assessment Demonstration Authority, or IADA, which requires that summative assessments be provided. And so several states are involved in the IADA where they're trying to create interim assessments, but also have it meet the IADA purpose of having some type of summative result at the end. There's another theory of action that doesn't require an IADA, and that's what many district superintendents have talked about. They said, if we're already administering interim assessments, couldn't we eliminate the summative and either get enough information during the year that we don't need the summative, or put it in some way that would create a summative for our purposes. It may not be the IDEA purpose, but enough for what schools we often use summative for. I'll talk a little bit about this. Vertical coherence, we're talking about the interim assessment in relation to other assessments or other systems that wrap around it. Horizontal coherence, about how the multiple interim assessments fit together. And I'll come to those other claims. So vertical assessment, you might have a system where that we have now, like what I call a governance ecosystem. You just have different assessments that provide different information for different purposes because they're owned by different people. So we have Tim's, Nate, and so on. That's sort of an informal system. A more coherent vertical system might be what I have here. General test, the same, then we need more specific information, so we have another test, then we need even more specific information. And so there are types of vertical coherence examples that I put on the slide, but I'll skip because of time limitations. Horizontal coherence, we need to have some type of idea about what we're doing over time, because we have assessments over time. So one of the things might be what the timing is in relation to instruction. In particular, are we looking back to things that have already been instructed on, looking forward to things that have not yet been instructed on. Also, we have the construct. What is actually developing over time, and what are we assessing for? And I give several examples there. As always with construct definition, if we define a different construct, we're going to have a different assessment definition. What are some particular challenges that we had? I've already mentioned some of these. Two that I wanted to highlight here is how the performance at a point of time is viewed as evidence. What is it evidence for? Are they comparable to each other over time? And then how are they going to be aggregated? You'll hear, in particular, Nathan and Michelle talked about tackling this problem. Because if, just as an example, if we have a test in Q1 and the student doesn't perform at a proficient level, do they get a chance to retest? And if they score higher, then which of those scores do we count? That's an aggregation problem. Maybe we count both, maybe we count the highest, maybe we count only the one at the earlier point in time. But that decision is a really important one, and you'll see and hear how it creates challenges for scaling. So when we have multiple purposes, I mentioned some summative and formative, then how is it that their interim achieves that? It may not be an impossible task, but it certainly is a new task than what we usually have. And I think you'll hear some about how people are wrestling with that. Some of the innovations that we have are looking at these new systems that have increased cognitive complexity of the assessment demands. They may be more complex because they're related to instruction or curriculum in a particular way. Certainly, we've seen them where they're complex because they're localized and people are making local choices about ordering or selection or scoring or even some aggregation parts. And then I mentioned some of those other ones. There are also innovations on the assessment side. And I don't have time to go into these, but our colleagues at NWA are among those really on some of these exciting elements. The only point I wanted to make about evaluation is just as we have new theories of action and different types of assessment, sometimes we can apply the same aspects of validation to creating validity, but we may be looking at different types of theories, approaches, or criteria for validating assessments. One has to do with sufficiency. So if we have performance assessments and then we have a few, typically we said that that's insufficient. But if we wanted to create some different claims, or if we have different conditions about ancillary evidence, then we may have different validity arguments. And we've usually wanted very high standardization. There may be advantages to actually to relaxing that and having more individualization that may create more valid things. I don't have time to go into that, but I just wanted to point out that that's an exciting area of development as well. Just about innovation, I mentioned that I think we're in a new generation. Part of that explicitly, I think, is that we have divergent theories of action. One is saying that accountability is the way to drive improvement. That's the federal program. I think there is a viable alternative arising that we can focus directly on instruction. And I think that's where many of the advances or work toward advancing interim assessments and balanced assessment systems is coming, where we're trying to satisfy both accountability and instructional. If you have comments or questions, I'd love to hear about them. Later, I'll turn the time over now to Nathan and Michelle.
Okay, thank you so much for setting that up, Brian. So if folks can't hear or see my slides, please chat me. Otherwise, I'm going to dive right in. And so the work we're going to be sharing today is based on Louisiana's Innovative Assessment Demonstration Authority pilot, or IADA pilot. And so we thought this work was particularly telling because it gives us a great applied context to see how systems of assessment can be acted in an operational context. And so whereas Brian spoke a lot about the different design choices and really spoke to theory, the next presentation, as well as the one following mine, is really about application. And so another way to restate this is simply, we're trying to put into practice the ideas that have been developed and around since at least knowing what students know. And so with that, I'll dive in and just note that we have an outline. So first, we're going to talk about context and design of the pilot. Second, we're going to dive into program theory and the theory of action and claims. And so I just wanted to note with these first two, we have a bit of a chicken and egg problem in that really the theory of action leads all of the work we do. But in putting this together, it's really hard to understand the theory of action unless you understand the assessment design. So we're leading with that, but also note that the design of theory of action claims and everything underneath is extremely iterative. So even here where we present things in a fairly linear fashion, the design has been anything but. And then finally, we will talk a little bit about scaling and give some preliminary results from last year, as abbreviated as it was, and finally conclude with some conclusions and next steps. And so first, I want to talk about the context and the factors that have really enabled Louisiana's assessments to move forward under IADA. And so very much this pilot has been a continuation of ongoing reform. And for the past number of years, Louisiana has been deeply engaged in supporting high quality curriculum. And one of the ways in which that has been done is through the development of open source curriculum called guidebooks. And so for the past number of years, they've been developing and revising it. And so the IADA pilot was very much a continuation of that reform. And so in 2018, they applied and were successful getting the IAD pilot and began development of content in grade 7. In 2019, there was a partial administration in grade 7 that was cut short because of COVID. And so when we were writing this proposal, we're really hoping to bring you more empirical results, but as like everyone else, things did not turn out the way we had thought. And so just to give you a sense of what the guidebooks 2.0 are, because they are so critical for this work, is that they're an open source curriculum, and they really reflect the way in which Louisiana has defined and understood high quality instructional materials. They have an evaluation tool for looking at curriculum, and this guidebooks is developed to meet it. And then most importantly to note as we move forward is the curriculum is unit based. And so for each unit in grade 7, there are 5 units. They're organized around a central idea with a main supporting text. And so one giver is the unit, or pardon, one unit is the giver. And so there's students engage with that book. And then the unit is developed around the themes and ideas of dystopia reflected in the giver. And so the units are very much a whole package. They have lessons, classroom guides, instructional activities, writing samples, you name it. It's meant to be soup to nuts curriculum. And so what's really interesting is this is provided free of charge and use is voluntary, But as of the time in which we're implementing the pilot, the majority of schools have chosen to use them in ELA. And so as we think about this idea of systems of assessment, we can first start with the status quo. And so this is a hypothetical figure, and we might think about how things usually look for a particular school or classroom. And so at the top here, we have the state, and we have a large-scale standardized accountability assessment. Then we may have some district assessments that have been used for district-level decision-making, followed by the activities in the classroom. And so what's really powerful, and in contrast, I think, to the work that other folks have been doing, is we actually have not only a common theory of learning for the schools that are choosing to participate in Louisiana in the pilot, but also a common curriculum. And so often when we talk about systems of assessment, this is a real struggle, is making a system be flexible enough to work over different theories of learning and then the different curriculum that come from that. Here, we actually have this really exceptional and extraordinary foundation of guidebooks. And just to note how unusual this was, this support for curriculum was guided by legislation. So in Louisiana, there's legislation aimed at supporting the use of high quality curriculum. And so this work stems from that. And so as we think about this for the pilot then, schools and districts that have chosen to participate have actually agreed to teach specific units. And so for the pilot, they've agreed actually to teach 3 units of the possible 5. The first 2 which they select as a district together, and then they all agree to teach a common unit. And so you can see with that commonality that really sets a system up in an interesting way in which state assessment can be tied to unit instruction in ways that are hopefully relevant not only for the state, but also the district and classroom. And just as an aside, Abby's work will not have this commonality. And so we thought this presentation would be an interesting comparison in contrast to the work Abby and Paul have done. And so just to give you a little bit of precursor of the assessment design. So based on that last figure, there are 3 windows. In the first window, students in the current design will be taking one of 2 possible unit-based assessments. And so it didn't have to be this way, but based on surveys of curriculum, these are the choices folks were going with in terms of their instruction during the beginning of the year. And students get to take one of these. So they'll either take a unit-based test on the giver or written in bone, which are 2 different units. And so the design of each unit assessment is very much about the ability to use knowledge and skill from the unit in understanding the text from the unit and similar and related texts. And so they follow the same general blueprint and are administered in 2 sessions, each lasting an hour. Similarly, we have a second window in which students take one of 4 unit assessments, and then a final window in which students take a common end of unit assessment on the behind the scenes unit, as well as a writing task, which is meant to ask students to synthesize over all of their learning and reading over the course of the year. And so tied to this is reporting, and we have reporting at the end of each window as well as at the end of the year. And so what this will kind of foreshadow is the way in which we've developed our claims in relation to the theory of action. And so that brings me to program theory and how we've really tried to engage deeply in that to develop our score interpretations. And so just as a high level, excuse me, I think Brian has talked extensively about the need for a theory of action. The only thing I wanted to add is that for quite some time, the literature has been clear about the need to really sharpen the score interpretations in relation to the theory of action. And so Bennett, Cage, and Bridgman is one reference I come back to quite often, and they talk about how the interplay between a validation argument and a theory of action can be used. And so again, in an ideal world, the theory of action would lead and basically dictate the score interpretations we want. But again, development is anything but. So whereas here it may seem slightly linear, in practice it's very much iterative. And so if we're thinking about validity, right, we can come back to this canonical statement talking about validity being the degree to which evidence and theory supports interpretation for proposed uses. And what we're trying to show in this presentation in the next slide is that getting down to what the specific uses are really takes a lot of careful work, and we'll show how we've tried to engage in that. And so as we've developed our theory of action, we had an overarching one for the entire program. And what we found is we really needed to break that down into kind of smaller theories of action. And the way we've done that is differentiating between within and end of year theories of action. And so we've cast our inputs, action mechanisms, and outcomes in terms of those. And so by diving into these smaller theories, we've really been able to help sharpen our use cases in supporting score interpretations. And so what I also wanted to suggest is that when we engage in systems development, multiple uses can be supported and multiple claims can be supported. When we're thinking about just one assessment, often we design an assessment to support one claim and one use. And then if it's used for other claims and uses, we often think that that is less fitting and is a bit of a stretch for the design. And so here what we're trying to say is that when we're engaging in systems design, hopefully we can really support those multiple use cases and their required score interpretations. And so I just wanted to flash up our working logic model for the end of the year design. This is a lot of boxes and we're not going to go through them. I just wanted to show for sake of example because I wanted to show two things. So, excuse me. First, time is an incredibly important factor in our work. We try to develop a general theory of action, but we really needed to tie it to when educators and others were getting information and how they were using that information. And so you'll see in this figure and the next, we put the time of year at the bottom of our theory of action and then try to show the connections between. And so at a high level, the theory of action for the end of the year information for actually summative score that we'll discuss in a little bit is that the assessment results really needed to signal how instruction needed to be implemented with fidelity to the guidebook. So it needed to speak to the ways in which instruction is and isn't being implemented based on the guidebooks. And so the idea is that by providing that signal, educators and leaders will work to ensure that guidebooks are implemented with greater fidelity and reflect on practice. And ultimately, the idea is then that student learning will improve in the next year. And so from that high-level summary, we can get to our use cases, which are, again, that signaling function, and also, because this is an IADA pilot, support state systems of accountability. So I haven't spoken too much in depth to IADA, but the basic idea is that for a subset of districts, innovative assessments can be used as long as the scores are also to able support systems of accountability. And so after we've sharpened our proposed uses, that brings us to test score interpretations. And so for our end of year theory of action, based on these use cases, we end up with this claim. So this claim is essentially arguing that we want to have an interpretation about how students apply their knowledge and skills gained from units of instruction and to read and write effectively generally, as well as develop meaning from text. And so we've gone from these use cases to this claim, and as a part of iterative design, we use design patterns and developed ALDs to support this as we develop the assessments. Similarly, we developed a little bit more simplified logic model for the within year work. And so as educators get back results from their first and second units, we hope that they engage in shifts in instruction. And so to summarize this, we want not only to provide information about fidelity of guidebook instruction, but also provide information that's going to help educators adjust subsequent unit instruction. And hopefully that will lead to improved student learning in the next unit. And so here our use cases are again signaling the need for guidebook instruction, but also guiding those subsequent next steps in the units. And so based on that, we developed a claim that was really comprised of 3 parts. It's about how students make sense of the text from the prior unit, how they make sense of texts that are related to the unit. And so the design actually gives them a text that is related to the theme. So for example, if we're talking about Giver, it would be another short text on dystopia and ask them to read and understand that. And then how they write effectively about texts from the unit as well as related texts. And so to summarize, the main gist is that when we design at the system, and if we're thinking back to Brian's presentation about horizontal coherence in particular, that we hopefully empirically can support multiple claims and their associated use cases. And in doing so, It may mean that we actually either provide different parts of student performance to support different claims. That's not the case here. But we may also use different measurement models across the subsets of assessment data to support interpretations and uses. And that is the case here. And that leads me to the final section of the presentation, which is work on scaling. And so I'm going to focus on supporting scaling in terms of that first claim, that end of the year claim about students after they've completed 3 units, and show how we were trying to support that. And so really this begs the question of begs the question about how we can create a summative score across multiple assessments. Just wanted to note that this has been kind of an ongoing question for folks who have been engaged in this type of design where the assessments are distributed. And so both this presentation and these specific comments bear on what we might call through course or what we might call interim models. And so folks have been talking about this, but there's been a bit of a gap in the research addressing how this has been created. But we wanted to note that creation of a summative score is not only a measurement question, but that of value judgments. And so Brian alluded to this a little bit, is when we have student performance throughout the year, what do we want to speak to? Is it end of year performance or performance somehow aggregated across the year, meaning that we're going to count what happens during the year in addition to what happens at the end of the year? And just to note that our claim, the claim that students can apply their knowledge and skills gained from units of instruction, really does require the production of such a score, not least of which is to support the use cases of the state's summative system, or the state's evaluative systems under IADA. And so our current approach is to actually pool item responses across the windows and create a scale and student scores based on that. Essentially what we're doing is we're saying windows 2 and 3 matter just as much as as the final window. And so in essence, we're essentially aggregating across the different windows to create a score. And this would be different from folks who are saying, well, I would like the end of the year to matter a little bit more. And so we can look at this empirically in terms of how students experience the test and what data they produce. And so what we can see is, for example, this hypothetical student 1 may take the giver in window 1, A Christmas Carol window 2, and then windows 3 take the common assessment, the behind the scenes, and then the end of year essay. A different student may have a different pattern of this data. And so what we're doing is pulling across this to create a single summative score, and essentially scaling this sparse item response matrix. And I'm going to be light on details here. We have a paper on how we've been trying to tackle this. And so as we think about refining claim 1, we may need to really nuance it so it does reflect this gradebook approach. And so as we think about what it means to apply their knowledge and skills gains from units, maybe we really need to reflect this time dimension in the claim and figure out how to better nuance that. And then finally, an open question is to whether or not this approach will produce a single summative score that is comparable to the statewide assessments. And that's an open question, and one we were hoping to address through gathering the full set of data, which we were not able to gather. And so whether or not our aggregating across the windows and counting each window is going to be comparable enough to the state summative is a question that we are going to explore. And it might be the case that we actually need to figure out how to, example, weight performance, or perhaps use performance from the first 2 windows as priors on the 3rd window, as some other states have been exploring. And so just to note, we did have data from the first 2 windows that showed, at least in terms of the ways we commonly look at unidimensional item response theory scales, things tend to work pretty well. We scaled this data using the 2PL and the generalized partial credit model. Did a lot of digging, particularly in terms of local dependence statistics, and things seem to be okay. And so that leads us to the next question of, if we produce this score, how do we gather validity evidence for this? And so our goal is to engage in formative evaluation of the program as a whole, and as part of that, collect specific validity evidence to support our score interpretation. So in particular, we're really interested in gathering data from the classroom, gathering student work and hopefully teacher observations to understand whether or not what our test is doing is in alignment with what is being done in terms of high quality guidebook instruction as a form of external validity evidence. And as we do that, we hope to iterate on the program in areas that can be modified. And to conclude, all of this is plans we have, and we know that it's very much in flux with COVID, but we hope to continue to design where we can. And so with that, I'll stop and turn it over to Abby.
Thank you, Nathan. And I appreciate you sharing that. It's sort of interesting because as we think about where we are today, I think some of what I'm going to share is a little bit more on the tactical side. So a year ago, when we were envisioning what we wanted to talk about at NCME, I think we really envisioned that we would be talking more specifics about some of the innovative work that we're doing. And of course, the world looks very different today than it did even a year ago. And so what we've really ended up with is a discussion today, I think, of how we have actually changed some of our processes and procedures, even as we're responding to that world of innovation in the Georgia IADA pilot and some other innovative work that we are doing. So when we think about this, we started with a problem and an opportunity that was there largely before COVID hit. But I think what I can say is disruptions have really forced and allowed us to reconsider some of our base level assumptions about what is and is not non-negotiable, what is and is not possible in the world of assessments. And the cancellations, I think, of assessment this year and sort of perceptions that our traditional models weren't able to adapt to the current context and how fast things are changing has really fueled a lot of conversations to look back to what was happening in some of the innovative pilots around needs for change. And I think it's been very natural to turn to the work that's been going on with the IADA pilots. But one of the challenges, I think, as you've seen, is those aren't scaled necessarily, or they're not necessarily on the timelines to be ready to respond. And the value that we need to start pulling out of some of the innovation may actually be shifting with the changing context of education around us. And so what this has done is this has really allowed us to take a step back, even as we're working with our partners in the state space and in the district space, and really think about how we're developing assessments and really developing to be flexible first, instead of trying to predefine a lot of the things that we would normally define, and really continue to test some of our assumptions and our values and pull some of those things, I think, that we can learn from the software industry and agile thinking into the development process to create a system that allows us to really attend to some of the challenges that we're seeing. It allows us to have some multiple theories of action for different users and buyers, but it's all centered around their role in accomplishing, I think, a very static job to be done. And we'll talk about that a little bit, but we feel like we've got a very strong job to be done in the fact that even with all of the changes that are going on in the system, the job that we've identified we're trying to enable folks to do has not changed. And that is sort of the hallmark of a good job to be done. So as we think about the approach that we've been taking, it's actually become a very transdisciplinary process. So we've gone back to first principles and principled design, and really are examining our assumptions both in a technical way, so things like unidimensional IRT, and in political ways, right? What are our assumptions about what has to be in place politically for things like security? How does that play into a world where students are learning in a much more hybrid or distance perspective? And those are things that we're still wrestling with. But what it allows us to do is to actually have some very rapid iterations of hypothesized testing and revising and continually coming back and testing, is what we're building maintaining the value that we need in a system to attend to some of those challenges, I think, that we've seen in the push for innovation and assessment. And Brian alluded to in the fact that some of our accountability architecture since NCLB had resulted in systems that people didn't feel were returning utility to actually change instruction the way that we needed to change instruction to see systems level change, and had resulted in some incoherent systems that didn't necessarily make people feel like we were telling the same story or necessarily tracking to the same things within our assessment system. We've also spent a lot of time talking about systems thinking and what does the learning system and the education ecosystem look like. I think we're all very cognizant of the fact that that looks very different today than it did at this time last year. And it's probably going to continue to evolve and look different than we thought we would be at right now. So we've extended that learning ecosystem into homes in a way that I think we haven't seen, or to an extent that we haven't seen. And then we've just been thinking a lot about agile development. How do you enable sort of the ingestion of things like personas and jobs to be done and short cycles and sprints and A/B testing into the process of developing an assessment, which, while it hasn't necessarily been linear, has had some very clearly defined buckets that we've worked in before. So when we talk about going back to sort of our first principles, we've actually had to challenge some of the assumptions that we've made in how we've developed tests before. So as Brian alluded to, there's been this desire to actually have solutions that focus on instruction first throughout the year, and prioritize time for instruction throughout the year, and really tell us something at the end of the year about what happened throughout the year, as opposed to sort of being, I think, what some of our partners have called a post-mortem, right? That just check at the end of the year. And so as we develop systems, how do we think about how those things build, and some of those challenges, as Nathan alluded to. We've started to really realize and sort of challenge our assumptions that there's not a lot of prior information we take into account about our students when we sit down to do these assessments, and really understanding that where we are now in a world of big data and technology and predictive analytics and those sorts of things, there's a lot of ability to take into account prior information about our students to make more efficient the work that we're doing. And one of the beautiful benefits of that is we are now in a world where we're not sending paper forms back and forth and waiting for scoring. And a lot of the scoring and data reporting can actually happen in near real time to impact what's going on in the classroom. And so starting from that paradigm actually helps us challenge things and have conversations with our state and district and local partners about what it is that they need to see and value in an assessment for it to be valuable for them. And so the first thing that we do is really sort of borrow from systems thinking and start thinking about the system that needs to be changed. And when we started this, we were leaning very heavily on the sort of the traditional concept of the learning diamond, and talking about things like the school ecosystem and professional learning as you think about how you build a system. Really, at the end of the day, all of this is about impacting our instruction to create change. And unlike the Louisiana project, where there's sort of some similarities in curriculum, we knew that in the case, for example, that we're working in Georgia, maintenance of local control over curriculum and pacing and those sorts of things was a priority. So that is a contextual piece that comes in. Now, that doesn't mean that we don't have a common theory of learning. So our theory of learning is really rooted in some work that we've been doing around developing range achievement level descriptors that I think look much more specific than a lot of times we tend to see in the industry. So with range achievement level descriptors as our theory of learning, we of course first evaluate those against the learning science and really understand within a standard, within a set of standards, how are things growing and how do students progress. But then we're spending a lot of time actually working with educators on the ground to understand their assumptions and how they're interpreting these and how these are being woven into the work of their classrooms. So we're able to account for that local context there. And then really just sort of focusing on assessment. And now we're trying to understand, how do we bring that home ecosystem? into our idea of how this system works and where we need to be having touch points in the system. It's more important than ever. And I think as an industry, we're still trying to understand how do we account for that in all that we're doing. It's just, I think in some ways made things very unstandardized and much more individualized, which is making us have conversations that we haven't had before about how we get the right valid measurements about our students. So sort of borrowing from some of our agile methodology, after we've sort of defined the system, we've sat down and we've really started talking about key personas and jobs to be done. And our key personas are really center around, I think, what you would say are some of those traditional players in the system: state and district leaders, teachers, school leaders, parents, and students. And they really all have the same goals, these same jobs to be done that you see up here on the screen. And I think we talk about them a lot in the education industry. But there's nuance in these, right? So the influences that they have over these jobs to be done are very different, and the role that they play. And so what this is enabling us to do by very clearly defining these and the roles that folks have is to think about the granularity, for example, in data reporting and assumptions that we need to make, and really spending a lot of time talking with folks at different levels about how we move forward to deliver the right value to enable them to pull the levers towards these jobs to be done in the system. And so it's that continually returning to what's most important and making sure we're still aligned and building systems to these jobs to be done that deliver value, as opposed to systems that are maybe kind of cool and we'd like to build, but may not be attending to these in the way that we had hoped. So we define things, and then we actually get into the concept of developing tests in a more agile way. And this really is designing assessment systems to be flexible and to rapidly change and really continually testing our values. So we spend a lot of time talking about vision and design and hypothesis testing and coming back, like, did what we just think we were going to do add value? And what this allows us to do is to fail early and not late and have a lot of little mini prototypes throughout the process. But then I think, as Nathan alluded to, right, there's all of these other constraints. There's policy constraints, there's IADA constraints, there's federal constraints, there's constraints just being on the ground and things that are important to the folks that are implementing this that come in and sort of nuance the value that you'd like to provide versus the value that you're able to provide. So that's nice and high level, but what does this actually mean in practicality? So this means that we actually prioritize some things, I think, differently than we traditionally prioritize in assessment design in that process. So we prioritize actually individuals and interactions above sort of our standard process and tools that we would use. And so this means we have cross-functional teams, we have content folks, we have developers, we have psychometricians, right? We have our program people all at the table, really at every step of the design and development process. We also have, if you go down a couple of lines, customers that are embedded in that design process. So it's continual testing and refining and conversations, and really collaboration to continue to refine what we're doing. And it means that we're focusing on working prototypes over sort of traditional documentation and checklists. And that doesn't mean that we don't have documentation, but it means that we're very purposeful in documentation around validity and efficacy, especially as we're doing small cycles of testing so that we can respond to change above setting a plan and continuing to just straight go through it. So you can see this is sort of a traditional assessment design and development process, and we know that there are cycles and iterations within it. But traditionally, we actually start with sort of this plan. This is the model. These are the intended interpretations and inferences and the things that we need to define. And we create that, sampling plan and those sorts of things fairly early in the process. as opposed to the process that we're using, where it's a continuous sort of back and forth between information gathering and validation at every single step of what we're doing. Even as we're getting into item design and development, there may be opportunities to actually change and challenge some of the things that we're thinking about. And it's a process. So when we think about things like field test planning and test design, you can see here we go through a lot of the same traditional steps, but we always assume, right, we get to the next thing, we're going to field test, we're going to test these options in front of decision makers and stakeholders before we actually implement on a larger scale out for field testing and those sorts of things. And that actually means that sometimes we go back to the beginning and completely redefine our success criteria, because we get something in front of the partner, in front of the customer, and they say, you know, that isn't really the value we thought that we wanted. And so you can see everywhere there's a star here, there's engagement and interaction with partners in this process. And it becomes a very big balancing act. We're doing a lot of things like evidence-based decision-making and sort of optimization problems. And these are all things that there's trade-offs on. And I don't think I need to go into these, but I think we need to understand throughout the process that we need to be flexible in all of these ways. So really what we end up doing is a whole set of really small experiments as we go on, where we're using sort of these optimization equations. So you've got the sort of the traditional value is benefit minus cost. But then when we start talking about benefit, we're really thinking about the importance of that job to be done, sort of multiplied by the perceived relevance of whatever piece of the design we're looking at, we're testing out. And then you can start breaking that out by sort of customer value and segments to understand like the importance and relevance minus the cost of that. There's always a risk in doing things different and being innovative. And so to get to sort of the ultimate options that we're looking at, you need to have a yes from a whole lot of decision makers in this process. And it can be tedious, it can be time consuming, and I think we need to understand a lot of times when we're trying to think about what we're doing, there's things that are proposed out there that are very innovative, but from a psychometric standpoint, if there's a lot of uncertainty, it's got to be a no, right? The risk and the cost of that is too high. And so we now, I think, as frustrating as the COVID-19 challenges have been, we've actually have a little bit more time to conduct some research and actually reduce that uncertainty so we can get closer to known solutions and known capabilities that can actually let us innovate, I think, a little bit faster than we anticipated. And the outcome of our studies, I think, will certainly increase certainty and innovation. This has required a whole lot of patience and flexibility on the part of our customers. But really, like when you think about it, right, no field testing because there's no testing, and the challenges of that we're all discussing about data this year, and our standard operating procedures and small sample sizes make it hard to do adaptivity the way that you would want to. So you could end up ultimately with a barely adaptive test versus a CAT versus a multi-stage assessment. And so right now, I think there's a lot of things that we're testing around technology. We're testing and validating research studies around things like longitudinal IRT and optimal calibration, really to get down to evidence-based decision-making, and to deal with some of the changes that we've had to the value proposition along the process. So in the case of Georgia, right, we're really looking at innovation driven by policy changes due to these concerns. We know that these are some of the very, very important things that we need to figure out. You know, making stakes too high, over-testing, testing time, all of the things that we traditionally hear in a system. And so what we're working to do is actually make small bets at key decision points. So what you're seeing here is actually program increments and teams within that increment. And you can see a whole lot of questions on here. which is where we're exploring solutions. We're doing a lot of cycles and A/B testing in that development process to really seek out the designs that are going to create the most value and inform instruction as we go throughout the process. The delivering in GMAP, we don't have all of the answers yet, but these are some things that we do know. You know, we're looking at fall, winter, and spring assessments. They will measure student performance relative to the state blueprint, but it's also very important that they adapt and that they measure both growth and grade level performance. They will return summative scores at year's end. And so the result is really going to be richer data about student performance during the school year. So to tell more of that holistic story, both about how students are growing and where they end up, and that's important. And the goal is not to have an extra summative test in the spring. So we're dealing with partners right now who we're doing fall, winter, and spring interim tests and a separate summative test. And so the goal is actually to create some efficiency by not needing to have those separate. What we know, even as the world has changed around us, things that aren't changing are some of these durable pieces of jobs to be done. So through your growth, adaptivity, multiple tests, instructionally useful data. And I think it's important that as we've had conversations, we've talked a lot about the importance of adaptivity. And I think this harkens back to things like the iceberg project or the iceberg problem, when we understand that unfinished learning really accumulates and persists. And we see sort of growing gaps because some of those prerequisites aren't there. So we've had a lot of conversations around range ALDs to help understand how we want to build the way that we adapt. And really within the intended content, how do we create content-based interpretations of scale scores within achievement levels? And so the idea is building on these, teachers are going to be using the range ALDs to determine how students with different scores within different achievement levels differ in their abilities. We've been doing this work with a state partner in Nebraska now for a number of years and have actually brought this forward into the Georgia project and have been doing a lot of work with teachers in this area. And this is helping to drive item and test development. Sort of going forward, some of our next steps are focused on some of our studies around interpretation. We've been doing a lot of focus groups and parent-student dyads to understand things like stakeholder reporting needs and what information is actually needed for parents and students to take agency in what they're doing. And we're continuing to move forward, especially around some of these interpretive studies as we go forward. So thank you, folks. Here's the contact information of sort of the team that's working on this right now. I'm happy to answer questions and just get thoughts about the work that we're doing. And I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to Carla.
Thank you, Abby. Okay, let me share my screen. Can you see my screen?
Yes.
Okay, thanks, Brian. I know I can't see, so I can't see the thumbs up. So I'm Carla Evans, and I'm with the Center for Assessment, and I have the distinct privilege of trying to draw some themes across the presentations we saw today. My remarks are going to be brief because I do want to allow the presenters to take questions from the chat. So if you have additional questions, please keep putting them in chat. And what I'll do is after my brief remarks, I'll start to go back. I know Roxana was the first one. We'll circle back up. And there was a series of questions for Nathan. But if you also have questions for Brian or for Abby, just go ahead and put them in the chat now. And we'll continue to take those. And then I also have some questions for them as well, depending on time. So what I wanted to draw across the presentations was just some simple barriers and facilitators that, as I read their papers and looked at their presentations, seemed to stand out to me as I was thinking about these innovative, if you will, balanced assessment systems that are trying to use information from the classroom or from these interim layers and provide state summative scores or other information that are useful not just for summative reporting, but could also be useful for instructional purposes. And as Brian said, right, that there's different theories of action. We've operated out of an accountability theory of action for a long time, and now there's more desire to design assessment systems that really provide instructionally useful information. And so some of the barriers that I noted across particularly Louisiana and Georgia's context, obviously federal requirements provide constraints, right? So for those that are thinking about this under the bounds of IEDA, there are certain constraints, particularly around comparability of scores, that you need a, end of year summative score. There's all the technical requirements therein. Now, we don't need to limit our conversation today to federal IEDA requirements, because there's a lot of assessment systems out there and ideas for balanced assessment systems that don't have to meet those technical requirements. But in those two situations, that's something that stood out to me that definitely has an impact upon the design and the theory of action from the very beginning. Also, communication among various stakeholders and levels, right? So making sure that all of the levels are getting the information that they need. And so I just appreciated hearing what Abby was just talking about, like having the focus groups and being sure to make that as they're developing in this agile development sphere, that they're collecting information along the way that they're going to use to then modify their development. But one key barrier is getting that information back and then using that within a development cycle to change things. And so that's something that our panelists could talk a little bit more about, how easy it is to change and to be agile and to be flexible given their theories of action and design constraints. Also, just implementation fidelity can be a barrier, right? We want this window into the classroom. Nathan was talking about this. The guidebooks in particular in Louisiana, they want a sense of, are teachers actually using the guidebooks as intended? What's the instruction look like? Are there changes to instruction happening? What does the student work look like? And being able to collect all that information and gather that is a challenge, which relates to my second to last bullet point, which is that research and evaluation agendas are difficult in this context. Being able to get that type of information, I know that for myself, I work with New Hampshire's large-scale performance assessment program, and getting the information about what's happening in classrooms is really challenging. And then also having a counterfactual for a research agenda, where you have districts who have bought in and are using the guidebooks and are, a part of the GMAP program or a part of New Hampshire's PACE project, but then you have lots who are not. And so when you're looking for an outcome measure that's going to be sensitive to give you a sense of, is this improving student learning? What's happening in classrooms? Are teachers changing their instruction because of the guidebooks or because of these interims or other, performance assessments? It's sometimes hard to get the counterfactual because the other districts aren't doing that type of work. And then finally, political pressures and changes. That for some of these programs, there's political things happening behind the scenes that can act as barriers, either changes in policy, changes in leadership, mandates coming down from policy spheres that can make it difficult in the midst of these programs to continue. And so what I want to offer to you is that these are barriers, but they can also be seen as facilitators. That's some of them. I put the question mark. I don't think all of them, but for example, sometimes political pressure is what gets these balanced assessment systems to even be a discussion point. And as Abby was just saying, these concerns about overtesting, these concerns about loss of instructional time and not providing information that's useful was actually something that propelled GMAP. So I don't think all of the barriers can be turnkeyed into facilitators, but some of them definitely can be. And then some facilitators, you heard these theories of action, and I'm sure our presenters would be willing to go into more detail about their theories of action, but I'm thinking of Nathan's in particular. You have these robust theories of action and guidebooks and other materials that are really intended to shape curriculum and instruction, and then the assessment is aligned with that. However, you know, if you don't have a robust theory of action and you don't have spelled out all the mechanisms and assumptions therein, that can act as a barrier. And I think the agile development, I'd love to hear more as that plays out in Georgia of what that actually looks like to continue to iterate a test development cycle and take feedback from these different partners and use that to adjust what they're doing. I think that's a really interesting idea. And then another facilitator, if you're really looking to provide instructionally useful information, if that's your theory of action, is obviously not just getting feedback from teachers, but buy-in, right? That they really understand the philosophy behind it and understand what it is that their curriculum and instruction and assessment, how those things work together to really promote this coherent, continuous, comprehensive, you know, useful and efficient system of assessments. So with all that said, I wanted to take questions from the chat first. So let me see if I can bring up the chat box here. And first throw it to Nathan, because Nathan, I know that there were questions in the chat for you. Roxana had the first question at 12:39 about the ways in which the selection of forms, because students in Louisiana could take different forms at different times, affects comparability of scores and the inferences therein. And then there were a series of other questions. Nathan, I don't know if you want to take those series and answer them in whatever way makes sense for you. And then I'll look into the chat to find other questions.
Yeah, I'd be happy to. And so I think the first question I see is asking, assuming the first and second forms are selected by school districts, how does the selection of the forms affect the comparability of scores and subsequent inferences? Which has been a challenge, right? Because anytime we introduce flexibility, suddenly comparability becomes a concern. And so scaling wise, we're really relying on that third window to help us put everything together. And so because we have that one common touch point, we're linking these other patterns of test taking together. And so actually what happened last year is you kind of have two distinct patterns of curriculum and instruction that kind of narrow into that third point. So there's one group using, we'll just say like guidebooks units A and B, and another group using like B and D. And they all came together at the end. So measurement wise, we're trying to correct for that using the assumptions of the IRT model. From a design perspective, we really tried to have the unit design be very similar. So they use the same basic blueprint. They have, to a large extent, the same types of questions within it. And so we tried to really design for interchangeability there, but noting that you have different texts, right? Like, and so when you ask students questions about what meaning they make from the Giver versus the Christmas Carol, they are different. And so I think part of the question then is, through a combination of design and scaling, have we been successful at making things quote unquote comparable? And that's where the external validity evidence also comes in. And so, right, we would like to collect student work from also these, from the classrooms to be able to compare. And then one other thing is students are writing on each of these tests, so we have the opportunity to do some qualitative comparisons. So that was a long way of saying there's no magic bullet. We've tried to adjust for it as much as we can. And we were hoping to be able to give you a more authoritative statement about that with, you know, a year's worth of data collection, but cut short. So Carla, I'm not sure if you want rebuttals to that or follow-up questions, or if I should just keep going down the line.
Yeah, I would say keep going down, and then if people have questions or additional clarifications, and then I'll go down and ask Abby and Brian some questions as well.
Okay, so the next question I have is, could you elaborate on the test development process for the Louisiana assessments? Does it follow a particular test development design, such as principal test design? And so I'll just say that we used evidence-centered design, and then anyone who have used evidence-centered design will say, well, what did you really do? Because every application of evidence-centered design becomes a customized version for a particular context. And so what we did is we started with design patterns for each of the unit assessments and tried to get folks to really articulate what they were after. And in doing so, they kind of came up with these 3 specific statements they wanted to make about students in terms of how they understood the unit text, how they were able to use that understanding and skills mastered to speak to related texts, and then finally how they were able to write across. And so you can see, even though we were using a design pattern and ECD, really that design looks like a lot of what you would see coming out of the constructing measures Berkeley assessment system, where you have meaningful levels and then items written to it. So we just let it go there and we wrote items to those levels. And so it was really kind of an evolving process that used both evidence-centered design and also the constructing measures approach. And then I think I'll just keep going, Carla. The third question is that given that the given that the use of guidebooks is voluntary, what do you attribute to the widespread adoption by teachers? And so if my colleagues from Louisiana were here, they could give a much better answer than I could, but I'll say there are 3 things. So first, because of that strong legislative support, Louisiana has engaged with districts in terms of using what they call Tier 1 curriculum. And so they've laid out criteria for high quality curriculum, and then they review. And so they've reviewed many curriculum. And if it's Tier 1, you as a district are good to go. Use it as needed. If you want to use what they'll call Tier 2 or 3 curriculum, as far as I understand, you actually have to augment the curriculum. So they'll say, well, this curriculum you want to use does not meet these criteria, so that needs to be adjusted in these ways. So then districts and schools can choose from a list of Tier 1 curriculum, one of which is guidebooks. A second point is that Louisiana has been engaged in extensive professional development. And so one example of that is every summer they have a teacher leader summit, which is a multi-day event providing professional development and other supports to educators so they can improve practice. And so that's just one example. And as part of it, they've really been deeply engaged in instructional supports. And an example of that is they have a diverse learners cycle that they engage in terms of a process of getting feedback from students to adjust instruction. And so what's interesting is guidebooks are kind of custom tailored to the professional development that they've been providing, in our case in point of it. So they provide broad PD support, and guidebooks is an excellent instantiation of it. So you have those kind of working in favor. You have a set of possible curriculum, one of which is guidebooks, professional development, which aligns very well with guidebooks. And then you have the fact that it's free. So the only cost to use guidebooks is getting the text. And so you don't have to pay for a curricular package. And so you can see that a combination of those carrots has really made folks say, well, if it's high quality, if it's similar to what other paid packages are, and the only cost to me is getting these textbooks, I'll go with it. And so that's my sense, and there may be other factors that I don't appreciate at play, but at a high level, that's my guess. And Carla, looks like I have at least one more question.
Why don't we pause here on that? We'll come back to that other question about Campbell's Law, but I saw the one at the end, which I think is more directed for Abby. So Abby, if you want to take that question, and it's just a concern about using interims to replace the summative. And you can read the rest of that question, but I'd like to give you an opportunity to respond, as well as Brian, if you wanted to say anything about that as well.
Yeah, no, I appreciate that, Carla. So the question was really about the concern for using interims to replace summative, and whether in doing so you miss out on integrative skills and long-term memory in what you're doing there. And so I think for us, one of the things that we're really looking at is being diligent and very careful in doing some testing and around how we are using the prior scores, right? So it's not just a checklist of I checked these things off, but really because we're rooted in those quite meaty range ALDs, understanding how students are growing, I think within content areas over time, we're exploring things like repeated blueprint model, where the content balancing may be largely the same over the course of the year, but because of those range ALDs and how we're adapting, we're actually allowing students to go deeper within those areas over the course of the year, and really allowing teachers and students to see how they're growing within the standards themselves. So it serves almost as a check, and actually, are we growing? Are we growing deeper as we try to get towards what that proficient level would look like, and then even beyond into the more advanced levels before we would ever get to the point that we adapt off grade. And I think what that allows us to do is that allows us to have some checks there. We've also had conversations, and I think this is one of the things we don't necessarily have all the answers for yet, because we're still testing and sort of mapping out value about, are there critical checks and critical skills checks that we just need to make sure are there. For example, in the second or third assessment, if a student really just knocked it out of the ballpark on assessment 1 or 2 throughout the year, that we actually want to build into the later assessments just to make sure that they're there. But really, when we start to look at the range ALDs and how things scaffold and build, and how all students sort of have that ability to access the grade level content, even if they're not quite ready to do it at the proficient level, and we're actually measuring how they're getting there and actually going beyond proficiency with the range ALDs, I think we mitigate that risk as we go through the process.
Thank you, Abby. Brian, did you have anything you wanted to add there?
Sure. I think it's a great point that our assessment design has to state what it is that we like. Our claims will state what we are interested in, and our assessment design needs to then capture that. So if we're interested in integrative skills or long-term memory, our assessment design actually has to do that. And it's not just interim versus summative. One of the issues about end of course exams, so you might think of a math test at the end of grade 9 and grade 10. If grade 9 is algebra and grade 10 is geometry, the question has been raised, when do you ever give students problems or allow them to demonstrate their ability to integrate their knowledge and skills of algebra and geometry? If you have a test that's only on algebra and a test that's only on geometry, you might miss that. And so that was one of the arguments for having an integrative test in grade 11. It's not an argument. I think that we're not arguing about whether there should be end of course grades, or because those are all end of course tests. Those are both summative, but it's entirely a question of design. If you want to assess for that, then you have to create the assessment design to do that. Similar for long-term retention or memory. If you're interested, then you probably have to test sometime after to see what students are retaining. So I don't think that's an issue just about interim and summative. I think it's a general question, but I think it's a really important distinction to make. What is it that we're really after?
Thank you, Brian. Yeah, that was really helpful. And feel free to if you have questions, keep putting them into the chat. But I want to circle back to Kevin's before we take some questions from the screen here. He had a question for Nathan, I think in particular, but I do think that this question about Campbell's effect could actually relate to every program we're talking about. And Brian, you could weigh in too, just in general, as we think about balanced systems of assessment. So I'll let Nathan take it first, because I think it was originally addressed to him with respect to the 2 priors. But then if anyone else wants to jump in as well.
So I'll just restate the question real quick. And it essentially says, if a system like this is used for accountability, how will the system resist pressures associated with Campbell's effect or Campbell's law, which, right, is essentially the qualitative or the corruption of quantitative indicators, right? Whenever we attach stakes to something, chances are people will try to game it and it stops meaning what it's meant to mean. And so I think there are a couple points in the Louisiana context. What we've been trying to do through PD and design is make it so that those needs to game the system is actually in line with good instruction. And so the entire point is to try to get folks to implement with fidelity. And so through aligning it to the curriculum, ultimately we're trying to prevent that gaming through messaging that essentially if you want to improve scores, fidelity of implementation matters, and working hand in hand with the folks on the ground. So because it's a small pilot, the state is in close contact and close support with those who are implementing the pilot. And so when they have questions, they actually come to the state and the state works with them. So that will be different in cases when it's not as closely tied as the curriculum. And I'll admit, even trying to focus on implementation of fidelity may have concerns. And so I think another way we've been trying to tackle this is trying to provide those two distinct claims and articulating them and trying to some extent, make people really focus on the unit-to-unit instruction. And then as we gather evidence for the end-of-year claims, try to bring them into alignment with one another so that the results don't seem disseparate. Because I think one unintended or negative consequence could be folks, and not that this would happen, getting signals that things are fine, and then getting a summative determination that things are not fine, which is actually, when you have multiple assessments, could be the case. And so we've been trying to at least head off that unintended consequence through the gathering of evidence and also our modeling. And more generally, we've just been really, really trying to elaborate on the unintended consequences of what this could be and try to design around it. So that was a long-winded answer, and I'll invite other folks to jump in as well.
Carla, I'd like to address the beginning of the comment. This is by Kevin Andrews, where Kevin puts the comment, I'm more inclined to use the windows before. This is Nathan's discussion of the Louisiana, where you have, in that case, it was 2 windows and then the final, but it could be any interim design where you had multiple interims and then you had something at the end, especially where you're trying to do something summative. I'm more inclined to use the windows before the final as priors. That is, you use them as information that you would then, if I'm interpreting this right, as a way to inform the assessment at the subsequent one. So if you think about a cat, then you would say, I used the information from the first quarter assessment in order to adjust the computer adaptive test in the second quarter. So if the student's lower, then I'll adjust for that. If the student's higher in the first quarter, then I'll adjust for that. And this is really an interesting question. It's under what I call, how do you aggregate or just use all the information? So one way to solve the problem is actually not to aggregate. So if you use priors, you actually you include the information to adjust the assessment, but you don't actually have to carry that value forward, and that solves the problem of having students who are scoring low on the previous interims scoring higher later. Of course, that's what we're trying to do with instructionally useful assessment systems. We're trying to give feedback so that if they're lower, there's actually some support they'll receive and their performance will change over time. And so that we're trying to say that the information about the student at an earlier point of time shouldn't be accurate. They should actually be higher later on. And so this is this question about why would we count that information? And as Nathan hinted about gradebook exams, there you can construct a really good validity theory and theory of action for why those would count. But if you wanted to make a claim about what the student knew at the end of the year, in fact, that information before may always be overturned by later information. So one way to solve that is to just use it to inform the assessments and then just use the summative ones at the end. But the problem that leads to is that you may not, if you're going to use a summative, if you're going to try to focus on a summative score, then you only need the summative test, because you can adapt that without having 3 quarters of interim assessments prior. You could adapt the last test much more quickly than that. So it's a sort of a balance that we're doing between instructional, which then says we're going to give these more extensive assessments during the year, but we're actually going to only use primarily the test score at the end if we're interested in summative. I think that's a design question that we still are wrestling with, and there are different designs floating around that solve that problem in different ways according to the values that people have.
Thank you, Brian. Yeah, and Abby, I want to give you the last word. I know we're wrapping up here in the last few minutes, and there was a comment just put in chat too. So, you know, you don't need to wrap that in to your response, but if we do have time, I'll circle back to Brian.
No, that's great. And I think those are the challenges we're talking about, I think are sort of the challenges and the reason that we've called for innovation, right? I think you go back to Campbell's Law, and we didn't ever intend for the summative assessments to feel like these giant hammers coming down on the tops of the heads of our schools and our teachers and our students, right? We all hear the stories about students crying and puking in the middle of a test because they're so nervous and so stressed out. And, you know, you see all the news about, you know, teachers trying to game the system because we started using them for things that we weren't supposed to use them for. And so I think as we're thinking about the innovative assessments, you know, in our particular theory of action, we've really rooted it around that job to be done and who are the players and what do they want for kids and what are the levers that they can pull, and really thoughtfully designing systems in a way that the data that's returned has utility for the right players in the system at the right level for them. So it's actually a help and not a hindrance. So in the Louisiana project that Nathan talked about, right, is the data coming back, helping teachers feel like they can go deep into the content and push some of those skills? Are we returning some really good information about how students are growing and where students are and where you might go next? You know, as we talk to teachers about this, like they're hungry for sort of that guidance from assessments on where do I dig deeper? Like I'm a teacher, I'm a good teacher, I'm a professional, but I can't be everything to every student. So what can you do to help me actually guide my instruction? So when we think about design from that perspective, around the people in the system and their role in pulling the levers for the jobs to be done to help our students succeed, you know, I think those just need to be continued conversations. We can't assume that we're going to build one system and get it right the first time and never change it, and it's going to be great. We need to continually be testing ourselves to make sure that our outcomes and our validity arguments really do get centered around that utility of what we return. So not just is the interpretation valid, but is actually what we're handing over useful to do the job that we need to do.
And that is a great final word, because I think that's what, you know, all of these balanced assessment systems are in response to. So thank you for attending. There is a link in the chat to a survey, and I just want to thank the presenters, for Brian, Nathan, and Abby, and their co-authors. Excellent presentation today, and really appreciate everyone taking the time to attend, and thank you to NCME for hosting it. So please follow up if you have questions. I know any of the presenters would be happy to send you slide decks or answer more questions, and I believe Nathan put those email addresses in the chat. So before you log off, grab those, and I just want to say thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.